Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Special Committee on Health, Opportunity, Prosperity, and Education for a regular meeting for Thursday, March 26, 2026. Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Chairman Pichado,
Present.
Vice Chairwoman Peterson. Present. Councilor Inderwan is absent. Councilor Royas.
Present.
Councilor Sanchez. 4 present, 1 absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to substitute what's before us, sub A. Is there a motion? The motion has been moved by Councilwoman Shelley Peterson, second by Councilman Miguel Sanchez. Any discussion? The motion has been approved and is before us. Before we go any further, I also would like to entertain a motion to enter Exhibit 1, a report. The motion has been seconded. And all those in favor? Any abstention, any nays? The ayes have it. It is before us and it is on the record, into the record. I also like to entertain a motion to for the exhibit number 2, presentation into the record. The motion has been moved by Councilman Roya, second by Councilwoman Peterson. Any discussion, any abstention? All those in favor? The motion carries, is into the record. At this time, just for the public's information, as you can see that those of you who are here, you see a large TV in front of us. But due to the improvement that we've made here in the City Council, now you could also see in the both screens to your right, to my right, and also to the left and on the side. And hopefully also you could hear as well, better than before. Is that a thumbs up? Excellent. And those of you who are watching online, again, this is the bill that we're taking on, and we have a special guest with us that's going to provide us with a presentation, and that is for the committee members to review, but also have the discussion here. And as a final, we're going to take a motion and hopefully move this forward after so many years of discussion, but many months of discussion within us, but also in the community. So with that said, I'd like to welcome our colleagues. Thank you very much for being here. I see Councilwoman Althea Graves. Thank you for being here. Councilwoman Jill Davidson. Thank you. Chairwoman and Councilwoman Mary Kay Harris. And I believe that is it for us, and obviously council members that are here. We're also joined by our law department, H.O.P.E, welcome. And of course our wonderful staff and team from the clerks. Thank you for being here. So at this time, what I'd like to proceed with is the presentation of and before we go, I just noticed also that our Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Aaron Gardner, is here for any questions that we may have within the committee's members, if we need clarification, along with our Brandon and also Gabby from Communication. Thanks for being here. I know we put a lot of work into this. So the first item that I would like to bring forward is the presentation by Miss, give me 1 second. Aquí está. Miss Tram Hong, Senior Associate from the PolicyLink.org. She will present to us and speak about rent stabilization across the country and in Providence. We have the link. Thank you and welcome virtually Can you hear us fine?
Yes, good
Excellent.
evening.
Good evening, and is everyone able to hear? Thumbs up out in the crowd? Excellent. So welcome, and again, virtually to the Providence City Council here at the state capital of Rhode Island. Uh, It's nice to meet you, Ms. Tram.
Yes, sorry, I'm seeing two of myself. It's a little bit jarring, but good evening, Chair Pichardo
Good evening.
and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this call to present on rent stabilization and for making it possible for me to do so virtually. I'm based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. So my name is Tram Huang. I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink, which is a national policy and research institute where I've spent the last few years tracking and documenting every jurisdiction in the US that has implemented some form of rent stabilization, approximately 200 of them. And I also support state and local governments in developing and implementing the policy. I'm originally from Oregon, a place that has had statewide rent stabilization for over 5 years, and have been in the Twin Cities for the past 9 years, where I've experienced the impacts of rent stabilization as both a renter and a homeowner. And in having many of these discussions across the country, I like to remind council members that there's a gift in not being the first. It means you can remain grounded in empirical evidence of the long term impacts of rent stabilization that have come from the 200 jurisdictions before you. And with any regulation, whether it's a tenant protection or a zoning change or parking minimum eliminations, comes a period of adjustment, anxiety, and uncertainty. However, you have decades of implementation to rely on to show how rent stabilization and robust housing development can go hand in hand. It's why investors and developers continue to build in Washington, Oregon, California, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., New York, and many other places that stabilize rents. So during my time with you today, I'm going to cover three main topics. The first is the literature on how rent stabilization works to improve housing affordability. The second is addressing misconceptions about rent stabilization. And the last is focusing specifically on the policy proposed in Providence. And then I'll be happy to answer questions. And before I dive in, I can't see video of committee members, so if anyone is trying to get my attention, I only see myself on the screen. Apologies. So feel free to interrupt.
Okay, certainly will. Thank you very much. And if you could
Thank
just
you.
also, I know you mentioned about some the organization that you come from, and also I think you shared also a little bit about your background and so forth. Can you do that
Yes.
again for me, please?
Oh, sure.
Yep.
Um, so I'm a senior associate on the housing team at PolicyLink. We're a national policy and research institute based in Oakland, California. And I myself have an urban planning background. And for the past few years, have been at PolicyLink, where I have tracked and documented every jurisdiction in the US that has implemented rent stabilization. So about 200 jurisdictions. And then I also support state and local governments in implementing and evaluating the policy.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for the warm welcome. All right. I have slides, and I'm not sure if. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. And I think, council members, you have a copy of the slides too, so we can follow along. So we'll start with the research. So if we go to the next slide, please. There is overwhelming literature that shows how rent stabilization is highly effective at increasing housing affordability and stability and decreasing displacement for tenants. And it provides broader benefits to entire communities, not just the households whose rents are stabilized. Next slide. One really important data point that I want to share, since conversations about the housing crisis are rightfully gloomy, is the potential for positive impact. And this is analysis from the National Equity Atlas, which shows that if Providence renters were not cost burdened in 2022, they would have gained over $358 million in disposable income. That is money that could have gone to down payments, college savings accounts, groceries, healthcare, and the local economy. And I'm sure this number has only grown since 2022. And the report that I shared with you all is filled with research and statistics on the impacts of rent stabilization, but I also want to highlight some specific stats. So if we go to the next slide, We can start with the effect of rent stabilization on stabilizing rents, which sounds quite obvious, I know, but is actually one of the things I find most overlooked when we're discussing the benefits of rent stabilization. So the research shows that rent stabilized tenants pay less than non-rent stabilized tenants. And in LA, that difference is more than $3,600 a year. In San Jose, California, renters who are stabilized save over $3,700 a year in rent. In New York City, it's over $6,000 a year and even upwards of $18,000 if you are a tenant in Manhattan. In Santa Monica, California, the savings are more than $6,400. And in Cambridge, Massachusetts, before rent stabilization was abolished, rents in stabilized units were 44% lower than non-stabilized units. Next slide. I also want to talk about how rent stabilization improves stability, especially in places where tenants are feeling the pressure of displacement and gentrification. In LA, moving rates decreased by 37% after the city adopted rent stabilization, and it decreased the most for Black and Latinx renters. In New York City during the late 90s, during a period of rapid gentrification, rent in unregulated apartments in gentrifying neighborhoods increased by an average of 43%, but only 11% in rent stabilized apartments in the same neighborhoods. Next slide. From a governing and implementation perspective, rent stabilization speed, scale, and cost efficiency are unrivaled by other policy options. It can take effect almost immediately and have tremendous reach. For example, in San Francisco, 173,000 homes are stabilized by rent stabilization, which is 3 times the number of affordable units that are provided through all other rental housing programs combined. And in New York City, more low-income households pay affordable rents in rent-stabilized housing than in public housing and subsidized rental housing projects combined. Now, we need all of those programs, but the pure number of households that can benefit from rent stabilization is staggering. Next, we'll move on to addressing some of the misconceptions about rent stabilization, and the biggest being its impact on the housing market. Now, when discussing this, there's an important distinction to make between its implications for the construction of new housing production and the impact on pre-existing housing supply. There is no evidence that rent control reduces the production of new housing. This is from longitudinal studies in New Jersey, where over 100 jurisdictions have had rent stabilization since the 1970s, and studies nationwide, including the coverage of LA and Washington, D.C. Those studies found no negative impact on construction rates. In general, other factors have far more influence on construction delays and housing production than the presence of rent regulations, such as interest rates that compel investors to invest in other commodities, tariffs that impact construction costs, and global supply chain issues, to name a few. The main difference between these things and rent regulations is that it's much easier to stop rent regulations from passing at the local level than, say, persuading the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates or the president to get rid of tariffs. Another way to think about this is looking at what happens when a city gets rid of rent stabilization, which is what happened in Boston, Massachusetts. And contrary to the industry's claims that ending rent control would lead to a construction boom, the city did not see an increase in construction. In fact, the housing market tightened, with vacancy rates dropping from 4% to 2.9% 4 years after rent regulation was abolished. So in regards to rent stabilization's impact on pre-existing housing supply, opponents of rent stabilization often point to the Diamond study on San Francisco. We can go to the next slide, which that study documented how some landlords converted their rental housing to condominiums. So there are a few nuances to uplift from that study. A closer look at the study shows that condo conversions were correlated with areas that were rapidly gentrifying. For the most part, the condo conversions did not happen in other neighborhoods that were experiencing a normal housing market. In normal market neighborhoods, landlords were apparently content to continue renting properties, presumably because rent stabilization was allowing them enough return and was not problematic. The removal of properties largely occurred in gentrifying neighborhoods in which landlords wanted much higher profits and removed units via condo conversion to get them. Now, one thing to think about is that condo conversion is not a reduction of the overall housing supply, but rather a repurposing of rental housing supply to home ownership housing supply. It is a mischaracterization, therefore, to claim that rent stabilization reduces overall housing supply based on this study. And in addition, if condo conversion is an issue, jurisdictions can follow in Washington, D.C.'s footsteps, where they passed complementary condo conversion laws. And DC's condo conversion law also pairs with its tenant opportunity to purchase law, which prioritizes giving current residents the opportunity to become the owner of their rental home upon condo conversion. So, the main lesson from San Francisco is that property owners can take advantage of loopholes to get out of the policy. And this doesn't mean that the policy doesn't work. We saw the statistics that showed it helped affordability, but rather that the policy had design flaws, and we can fix those rather than writing off rent stabilization as a whole. If we go to the next slide, on a more positive note, we have seen rent stabilization and robust housing production go hand in hand. And this is not because rent stabilization creates units. It doesn't, right? It's a protection tool, not a production one. But it further proves the point that other factors beyond rent regulation shape production. We've seen this in places across the country. In the Bay Area, for example, the 6 cities that had rent control produced more housing units per capita than cities without rent control. In Montgomery County, Maryland, which passed rent stabilization in 2023, building permits hit a 10-year high in April 2024. And in Portland, Maine, which passed the strongest policy in the country in 2020, the city experienced a 175% increase in the number of units permitted for development between 2020 and 21, despite the policy having no new construction exemption. So, of course, this is, again, not to say that rent stabilization creates units, but rent stabilization and housing production in the right environment can go hand in hand. The next slide, I want to also tackle a myth about property values. So, I've done more research on this recently, given concerns that have come up, and a review of the literature shows that rent stabilization does not reduce property values. One study of New Jersey cities found that there were no significant differences between cities with and without rent stabilization when it
Excuse me,
came to new
excuse me for a
Yes.
second. Can you just start over again? I know there was a break in the audio. Can you just
Oh, I'm
start
so
over
sorry.
on that one, on this
Yes, of
screen? Thank
course.
you.
Yeah, thank you for letting me know. So the next myth I want to tackle is about property values. And I've done more research on this recently, given concerns that have come up. And a review of the literature shows that rent stabilization does not reduce property values. One study of New Jersey cities found that there were no significant differences between cities with and without rent stabilization when it came to both new construction rates and property value changes over the course of a decade. This is significant because, like I mentioned earlier, about 100 cities in New Jersey have rent stabilization. So it's a pretty large sample size and over the course of many years. Research in Berkeley and Santa Monica also found similar results related to property values. Even with rent stabilization in place, Berkeley's median value of owner occupied units nearly doubled between 2000 and 2010, and Santa Monica's median home value increased 4.5% from 2010 to 2015. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about some really important scenario modeling that was done by the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, which they used real estate pro formas to calculate what investor returns would have looked like with rent stabilization in Minneapolis. And most importantly, they compared that calculation with actual rent increases. So I'll walk through the bars of this graph and explain it in more detail. The first bar, starting from the left, looks at the internal rate of return, which is a common measure of profit that investors use. Internal rate of return for apartments that increase rents by the average rent increase in Minneapolis during the period of 2009 to 2019. The second is the internal rate of return for apartments that increase rents by median rent increase in that same period. And the third is the internal rate of return for apartments that had the highest rent increases in the city. So about 90th percentile in terms of if we're looking at the whole range of rent increases. Now, as you can see, the highest rent increase, where it's labeled Minneapolis High, had the highest internal rate of return. And that makes sense, right? Increase rent by higher levels, you have higher profit. Now, what researchers did was they took a look at historic rental data and applied theoretical rent caps. They asked the question, during the period of 2009 to 2018, what would internal rates of return have been if there had been rent stabilization and landlords had increased rents by the annual cap? And what they found was the bars on the right-hand side of the graph. And I can walk through those as well. So the one that's labeled 75% of CPI shows what the internal rate of return would have been if landlords had increased rent by a rent cap equal to 75% of CPI between 2009 and 2018. So here you can see that if rent cap was applied, the returns would have been the same as the Minneapolis average rent increase. Now, if the rent cap had been equal to CPI or inflation, the internal rate of return would have been higher than both the average and median rent increases. And then if we look at the two columns or two bars on the right, if the rent cap had been CPI plus 3% or CPI plus 7%, both very high caps, the internal rate of return would have been higher than average, median, and highest rent increases. So, what does that tell us? It shows us that even in the absence of rent stabilization, landlords were able to increase rents as much as they needed to cover operating costs and profits without exceeding theoretical rent caps. Next slide, please. In other words, the average apartment owner would not have been affected by rent caps if they had been implemented in the past during that 2009 to 2018 period. And even the strictest rent caps, which were 75% of CPI, would only affect a minority of apartment units. That's a really important learning, I think, that actually uses real estate pro formas that are being used in the market. And I think that type of research is quite rare. We'll go to the next slide. Now, another benefit of rent stabilization is that it equals the playing field for local operators by interrupting the cycle of speculation and wealth extraction that is allowing predatory investors and corporate landlords to buy up our communities. When we ban their predatory behavior and push them out of the market, we create more space for small local developers and property owners who don't have to compete with the multi-billion-dollar corporation, and most importantly, who are stewards of housing in our communities, as opposed to seeing it purely as a vehicle for profit. Next slide, please. Now, in the debate to pass rent stabilization, I often see policymakers get caught up in a false choice, which is that we can either have rent stabilization or other protections. And I and my team at PolicyLink encourage an abundance perspective, which is that we actually need all the tools. We need to pass everything. The housing crisis that we're in was a death by 1,000 cuts, so we will need 1,000 solutions. And rent stabilization is not the silver bullet, but there is no silver bullet, and we cannot solve the housing crisis without rent stabilization. So here are some of the ways that rent stabilization complements other much needed housing strategies. One is that it limits the potential for rent inflation in subsidized units, which can make our housing voucher dollars go farther and be more effective. It dovetails really well with tenant right to counsel, which provides tenant lawyers with more tools to eviction.
Are you still there? I think we just lost the audio.
Oh, I think
Okay, can you hear
you're
me?
back. Yes.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
Give
couldn't
us
hear
1
myself
second.
either.
Okay, just give us 1 second. We're going to reconnect again. We see you now.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. We'll blame it on the technology. We're still
All
trying
right.
our best here to adapt this new technology, and so far it's been great. So we're back online? Excellent. You may
Perfect.
proceed.
Thank you. I think I left off at right to counsel. We'll see. So rent stabilization also dovetails well with tenant right to counsel, and it gives tenant lawyers more tools to fight evictions. And when paired with just cause, rent stabilization and just cause together can protect tenants from multiple forms of displacement: economic displacement, lease non-renewals without cause, and discriminatory and retaliatory evictions. And probably most importantly, but I did not put on this slide due to space, is that rent stabilization keeps tenants in their homes while our housing production strategies can kind of catch up to the gap in housing supply. We know that increased production is necessary, but building takes a lot of time, and while that takes place, rent stabilization can help keep people in their homes now. And next slide. Lastly, I find that opposition to rent stabilization often leans on economic conventional wisdom to claim that rent stabilization won't work. But the assumptions that come with that wisdom have been overturned by empirical evidence. And I am not an economist myself, I'm trained as a planner, but I have talked to some academics out there who have done a lot of work in the field of economics on housing policy. So I want to share a few of their words that they've had published in various pieces about rent stabilization. The first is from Dr. Mark Paul, who's at Rutgers, who writes, "Nearly every Econ 101 student learns that minimum wages are a bad idea. Decades of empirical work demonstrate that minimum wage laws do not generate job losses, nor does the policy hurt low-wage workers, as many economists had claimed. It seems the profession's anti-rent control stance is well poised to be the next piece of, quote, conventional wisdom to tumble. It's time for us to rethink rent control and come to terms with the data which support it as a common sense approach to start righting the ship." And then the next piece that I encourage you all to read, I've linked it in the presentation, but I've just pulled a sentence from, are from two economists at the Open Markets Institute who write, the truth is that the market itself needs to be fixed. Specifically, any plan to overhaul the housing market needs to first confront the power of landlords to raise rents." Next slide. So to summarize this part of my presentation, I'll share some other policies that put your proposed one into context. And as you can see here, many cities cap their rent in the 2 to 5% range. So you are in good company with the ordinance that you all are discussing. So a few examples here are from Minnesota, New Jersey, and smaller cities in California. And you can see a mix of flat percentages that change depending on if the tenant pays certain utilities, percentages that change depending on if the tenant is a senior, and then we have some CPI-based formulas as well. And then the last thing I want to talk about, which is all on one slide, but I'll spend a few minutes on this, is speaking about the specifics of Providence's proposed ordinance, which I've looked through and think is quite strong. I've seen enough policies from across the country to recognize design flaws, and I want to point out a few of the ways the proposed ordinance has actually learned from those pitfalls. So a few pitfalls that you all are avoiding, and I'll just kind of run through the list. Your base rent definition is great. It has a back date of 180 days, which really makes the ordinance effective upon passage because it avoids landlords having the incentive or even chance to increase rent as soon as they hear about the policy. So it protects tenants from, at worst, retaliatory rent hikes, which have been used to punish tenants who are organizing for tenant protections, for example, demanding repairs, or otherwise attempting to enforce their rights to safe and habitable housing. The second thing I think is strong is how you all clarify utility billing changes and clarify how changes to utility billing can impact rent increases, because it'll avoid landlords adding utility related junk fees, surcharges, or administrative fees to try to circumvent rent caps. And this is just a very relevant issue. Within the past few years, the FTC has opened up multiple notices of proposed rulemakings about junk fees related to rental housing. So this is a very good aspect of the policy. The next piece is the definition of market removal. Currently defined, it is at least 90 days to be off market, to be considered removed from the rental market. And this is strong because it avoids creating the incentive for landlords to temporarily take rental housing off the market so that they can increase the rent above the cap. We see that kind of loophole exploitation a lot in California. They're referred to as Ellis Act evictions, where landlords claim to no longer rent out a housing unit, but tenants will see their unit back on the market for a much higher rent just a few weeks later. The next piece is partial vacancy decontrol and allowing only one standard increase upon vacancy. This is great because it avoids creating the incentive for landlords to evict or non-renew leases so that they can flip a unit. And in places where full decontrol exists, where there's no limit to rent increases at the point of vacancy, landlords are incentivized to evict tenants, especially in places without just cause eviction protections. The next thing is housing standards compliance. That's kind of a best practice for me. It ensures that landlords cannot defer basic maintenance and expect to be able to increase rent or increase rent beyond the cap. Next is the formula that you all have for property tax adjustments. I think it's key because it acknowledges the proportionality of the impact of property tax increases on rent increases. We often hear landlords say that because their property taxes went up 10%, rent should go up 10%. But we know that is not necessarily the case because property taxes are only a portion of rent. And generally, if a property owner still has a mortgage, that will be the largest piece of their monthly cost. The formula will not only help with implementation, but also ensures that anyone reading the policy understands that concept of proportionality. Then there's the tenant notice for improvements, and that requirement not only for improvements, but also appeals and other processes, which I think is strong because you really need transparency and the opportunity for tenants to dispute if needed. If nothing else, tenants who know they can't afford an upcoming rent increase that their landlord is requesting from the city will have more time to search for new housing. And then you have the hearing timeline requirements, which I think are strong. Requiring hearing within 90 days of filing is key because it avoids situations in which tenants lose hope that any decision will come out of the process or that the decision will take place soon enough to have a material impact on their situation. Some tenants, if there is no window in which the hearing has to happen, they will choose to move or self-evict just so that they can move on with their lives and avoid pressure from their landlords or avoid clinging on to hope if they know it's not going to work out anyways. Next is the explicit allowing of collective complaints. Now, this is something that I think people really overlook when it comes to implementation because allowing collective complaints helps to avoid redundancy and wasted time. It allows more cases to be heard. In St. Paul, for example, nonprofit legal aid providers were forced to represent multiple clients in one building and all of them as separate cases, even though they were all disputing the same rent hike, because the city did not allow collective complaints. And so collective complaints would have saved everyone time and resources. The nonprofit legal aid providers could have helped all of those tenants in the same building dispute that rent hike in one case as opposed to 20 separate ones. And then lastly, leveraging the city's fines and fee system for violations ensures that the policy has teeth. In St. Paul, for example, voters actually had to go back to the ballot 4 years later to pass administrative citations as an enforcement tool because we didn't have one in place. So for those reasons and many more, I have found Providence's proposed policy to be strong and one that really learns from the mistakes and weaknesses of other policies. And that is all I have for my formal presentation. Thanks for giving me the time to share. I know it was a lot of information. I'm happy to take any questions now or answer them later if you'd like to get connected via email or phone.
Thank you, Trom, Ms. Hong, for that wonderful presentation. And to our colleagues, you do have in front of you a report called Our Homes, Our Future, Rent Control Explained for Electeds by Ms. Trom Hong from the policylink.org. At this time, what I'd like to do is also recognize Council President and the main sponsor of rent stabilization, Rachel Miller. Welcome. And at this time, also would like to entertain some questions before I chime in. Questions? Councilwoman Shelley Peterson.
Thank you. Trom, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I I wanted to ask, because it's something that has come up in our ongoing listening sessions and in speaking with financial colleagues that support the city, but also really have taken and reviewed our this particular ordinance. The question I have is related to shifting the tax burden onto single-family homeowners. And one of the things that continues to come up is that the burden of the lost revenue from what we're trying to do here would then shift over to the single-family homeowner. In your experience in reviewing all of these municipalities that currently have rent stabilization, have you seen that particular trend as something that's common, or have you seen it at all?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I did do some additional research on this within the last few months because it has come up a lot in conversations. And what we can say based on longitudinal long-term studies is that rent stabilization does not hurt property values. I had mentioned the New Jersey study and some of the numbers in Berkeley and Santa Monica. Those are the long-term studies that are out there. And because property values are not impacted in the long term, then that fear of shifting burden of taxes onto single family homeowners does not come into fruition. And so I'd say based on the long term data, the data shows that rent stabilization does not hurt property values, therefore that fear is somewhat unfounded. I think when we think about short term, temporary fluctuations in housing markets need to be much more long lasting and much larger to impact tax burden and tax revenues. For example, economists have found that the relationship between a property's sales value and its assessed value is weak. So, with any market downturn, you'll see perhaps a drop in home prices, or such as when interest rates rise, you'll see some home prices drop. When interest rates drop, you'll see some home prices rise. But a decrease or increase in property value does not automatically translate to a similarly proportioned increase or decrease in property tax revenues, because assessments themselves don't respond so quickly to market changes. And I think, regardless, if we think about how governments approach taxes in general, they can take steps to equitably ensure sufficient tax revenue by adjusting rates to maintain revenue in anticipation of decreased assessments, which is something that you already do. But what we've seen in the literature is that in the long term, the research shows that there is no impact on property values.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councilman Reyes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tom, for your presentation tonight. I was wondering if you could go or provide this committee with local context, with you having associations with St. Paul and Minneapolis. There is also this ongoing assertion that in St. Paul, after the passage of rent stabilization, we've seen rising rents exceed Minneapolis as the current status quo. And so that's one clarification I'm looking for you to expound on. The second piece is, can you provide local context to this assertion that there was a immediate drop in construction permits after the passage of rent stabilization? And if I could sneak in, I guess one thing I discovered, and maybe you can verify this or actually say what I've discovered is not factual, but in terms of the construction permits, as of the most current data I've looked at, we've actually seen a steeper decrease currently in Minneapolis in terms of construction permits compared to St. Paul. And I was wondering if you could verify that as a as a fact.
Yes, thank you for this. Sorry, I'm taking notes so I make sure I answer all of them. Um, so context on St. Paul and Minneapolis in terms of rent increases, the assertions around supply dropping or permits dropping, and then verifying information about a steeper decrease in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Okay, let me tackle those. Thank you. I appreciate the question. Yeah, as someone who lives in the Twin Cities, we have been in the news a lot in the last few years for more reasons than just housing. And as we've experienced throughout that time, the coverage is not always accurate. So I especially appreciate the chance to clarify as someone who lives here. Um, so I think the important thing to think about is that rent stabilization does not decrease rents, right? It still allows rent increases. And so St. Paul, Minneapolis, many other cities in the last few years still saw increases in rent. And I have not seen reports that Minneapolis rents have increased less than St. Paul rents, at least for asking rents, which is a measure that is commonly used. I will get back to you on that one just because I haven't seen the data. I just have to look at it, right, and find it. But from what I've seen, there isn't a very clear, people aren't saying like, oh, rents are much cheaper in Minneapolis. In general, rents are cheaper in St. Paul just due to the housing market. So to add a little bit to that context, St. Paul is the state capital. It's always had a slower development market than Minneapolis for many reasons, including 22% of its land being property tax exempt because there are many government buildings. It's home to the state capitol, the city council buildings, the county seat. There's many churches, colleges, and universities. So 22% of the land is tax exempt. That means that St. Paul naturally has higher property taxes. And Minneapolis is seen as that city with Fortune 500 businesses. St. Paul is the more like government, college, religious institution city. So that's kind of the comparison between the two. So in that sense, St. Paul has always been a slower market and cheaper home prices, lower rents. Another thing to think about is prior to rent stabilization's passage in 2020, the St. Paul City Council authorized hundreds of permits for a unique mega development on the former Ford plant site. It's a 122 acre, basically a vacant plot of land that the city had spent decades trying to create a master plan for. And in 2020, they finally approved hundreds of the permits for that. We also had a new soccer stadium pop up, and a lot of apartment buildings come up and have permits approved in 2020. So the presence of both of those large developments pushed up the pre-ordinance comparison metric, making the drop between 2020 and 2021 much greater. In reality, 2021 permit numbers, which was the year that rent stabilization was passed, 2021 permit numbers were greater than they were every year between 2008 and 2019 in St. Paul. So the drop we saw between 2020 and 21 is after the approval of permits for two mega developments. The other thing is looking at the timing of the permit information itself. So if we look at years, we see a drop between 2020 and 2021. But if we look at the months of permitting, that really does not line up with the assertion that, rent stabilization caused a drop. And I kind of walk you all through the timeline, which is that January had normal development, and then February is when the steep drop off took place. That's 3 months before rent stabilization was even put on the ballot. Signatures were collected, and rent stabilization was placed on the ballot in June and was approved by the voters in November. And the ordinance itself did not go into effect until May of 2022. So the claim that rent stabilization caused the drop doesn't quite line up because the drop happened before it was even put on the ballot. And if we look at what happened after Election Day, permits actually began rising in December of 2021, which is the month after voters approved rent stabilization. So I think a closer look at the monthly permit data shows that that claim doesn't hold water, and the timing is off. Let's see. The other thing you wanted me to, the last thing was, I'm so sorry,
No, it's
Councilmember, can you
no.
remind me?
I gave you a lot to comment on. The last one was looking at current data in terms of construction permits from Minneapolis to St. Paul. What I've found was that there has been an actually steeper decline in construction permits right now in Minneapolis compared to St. Paul, while St. Paul currently has enacted rent stabilization.
Yes. I can confirm that when we are looking at, sorry, let me pull up some numbers. Um, yes, when we compare permits in 2024 to the 2020 to 2023 average in between Minneapolis and St. Paul, you are right. Minneapolis experienced a greater drop than St. Paul. And I think it's important to mention too that these dramatic drops in new permits, especially when we look at that window of 2020 to 2024, have also taken place in similar sized cities. So Cincinnati, Ohio experienced a drop of 77%, St. Louis experienced a drop of 68%, Denver experienced a drop of 52%. And it's important to name that none of those three cities that I just named have rent stabilization. So, um, rent stabilization, it's can't really draw a correlation because these drops are happening in places that don't even have it. So again, it goes back to this idea that there are much larger forces at play.
Thank you. Further question, Councilman Royce? Thank you. Councilman Miguel Sanchez.
Thank you. Councilman Roy actually, asked the main question I had in terms of how development was impacted in the Twin Cities, since that's where you're from. Thank you, Trom, for this presentation. It's very clear points that we've been discussing for a couple months now. I would wonder, Tom, since you have studied and been involved in so many studies and legislative processes, you could say across the country, you obviously have been looking at it on a very policy lenses. But I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments regarding the political challenges that rent stabilization, rent control legislation has across the country. And to be more specific, all the lobbies and associations that, spend a tremendous amount of money to oppose this kind of legislation. I don't know if you have any thoughts or experiences on the political aspect of it.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. And, this is based on my experience with campaigns in Washington, California, in Maryland, and states where it's still being considered, right, such as Massachusetts and Illinois for a long time. So I think big picture, when we think about just the real estate industry, they have a very vested interest, and this is very evident in how much money they spend politically to lobby at the federal level, but also lobby at the state level and local level. They have a very coordinated network that seeks to protect those self-interest, which, we live in a capitalist society. The self-interest of a profit-seeking entity is to maximize profits, right? And so their self-interest is to protect their right to increase rents as much as possible. And that, if we back up a little bit in history, is one of the reasons why in the 80s, during the Reagan era, we saw so many real estate lobbies back preemption laws at the state level. That's why so many states currently have a state ban on local rent control ordinances. That was a coordinated effort by the real estate lobby to pass those preemption policies, and it's been very challenging politically for states to lift those preemptions. Um, if you think about, Oregon, for example, they actually still have their local preemption in place. They passed a statewide policy, but the preemption that prevents local cities and jurisdictions from passing their own rent stabilization policies is still in place. And so I think that shows you how challenging it is to lift preemption. They can pass a statewide policy, but they still haven't been able to lift it. I think what I've also learned from working on campaigns across the country is that, the it can be easy to stoke fear around a policy like rent stabilization. And they've invested a lot of money in paying for studies that stoke that fear. I think a good example is the one that came out of Massachusetts, making claims around property values and property taxes, which has a ton of flaws related to its methodology, which I can go into at a later point if people want me to. But when it comes to our housing crisis, and when it comes to the places that we live, sleep, eat, I think there's a lot of fear that can be attached with changes that happen. And so I think the opposition can sometimes take advantage of that and use that to sometimes pit community members against each other when really we're all on the same side, right? Our community wants people to be able to live in their homes as long as they want, whether they're a homeowner or a renter. And yet we see research that says, hey, if we, or quote research, right? Not empirical evidence that says, hey, if we help tenants, this might hurt homeowners. So I think it's really important for us to step back, take a deep breath, look at the empirical evidence, and think about who's telling us what, and what the self-interest is, and looking at these other places that have passed rent stabilization, 200 places. I don't think we appreciate the levity of that enough, because if a policy had been passed in 200 cities that wasn't rent stabilization, I don't think there would be that much debate. That's a lot of precedent and a lot of places that we can lean on to say, hey, the real estate market hasn't been destroyed in California, certainly hasn't in New York, it certainly hasn't in Oregon, Washington. These are places, cities, states that are thriving still, and they have rent stabilization. So the abundance approach here is important. We can have many things at once. We can protect tenants, and we can protect homeowners. We can pass tenant protections. We can also change zoning to make building easier. We need all of these things. And I think sometimes the opposition will create fear around like a very specific idea, and we need to take a step back and think about rent stabilization as one piece of a much larger approach that we need to take to solve the housing crisis.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, and I'll open it up to other colleagues that are present here if they would like to ask some questions. Just in reference to the your presentation regarding the 4% and what you described it as most of the rent stabilization cities and states that have are tied to CPI. For us here, how do you compare that? We don't have it tied to CPI. How do you compare it to what's before us? That we have a 4% cap before they go before a board to raise it up to a cap of 10%, justifying their cost, whether there is a large repair of a roof, a boiler or other improvements. Compared, can you speak to that a bit? And then the other one that I would have is that in reference to the fair return and the return on investment, when you spoke on the return on investment, and you compared it with rent stabilization and one without. And then lastly is, in these 200 places that you referenced that there's rent stabilization, is that also just rent stabilization or rent control? And can you describe both if that's, if you're able to do so, in a sense that, to clarify for people and for us, as we say, rent control as it was implemented in other cities many years back compared to what it is now.
Yes. Sorry, I am keeping track of the questioning. I might go back to you if I can't remember the last one. So starting with the comparing the cap with other places. So I'm looking at the slide that I had now, and I think the proposed cap in Providence is well within the range that we see with other cities. What we find is that statewide policies tend to have higher caps, but that is more so a result of the legislative process and the negotiations, the push and pull that has to take place in order to pass a policy. In states, the original proposed bills always have a much lower cap than what is ultimately passed. Whereas what we find in cities is that caps are much lower than what we see at the state level. And so, Trenton, New Jersey, for example, has 4% annual rent cap, 2% if the tenant is a senior. Um, Antioch, California has 60% of CPI or 3%, whichever is lower. What we actually found during the more recent years of incredibly high inflation is that there were some cities in California who had a CPI based formula. It was, CPI or 50% of CPI or 75% of CPI. And they actually went back to the city council and had to strengthen the policy and add an additional flat cap because inflation was so high. So, for example, there's a year when inflation was 7%. So I can't remember exactly which city, but they had to go back. I think it was Oakland or Richmond. They went back to city council and asked for, in addition to our cap being 60% of CPI, can we say 60% of CPI or 3%? Because during these high inflation years, 60% of CPI is still too much of an increase for tenants to bear, especially when incomes were basically dropping relative to inflation. So I hope that speaks a little bit to kind of the CPI conversation. And then when it comes to the formula, or I'm sorry, not the formula, the appeal process for landlords to go through to increase rent more than the cap, I think that is a very, depending on how the process is designed, generally having a process like that is a great idea. There was recently a report that came out of Montgomery County from the county that was in charge of implementing the policy. And what they found was that the few landlords who did use that appeal process got their extra rent increase approved. And it was because they provided the evidence that showed that they actually needed the rent increase due to changes in their cash flow, due to unexpected costs, things like that. So as long as there is evidence-based process for landlords to justify their need to to increase the rent more than the cap, then that is generally a good pathway to have, because the cap does not work for every scenario, but you want to make sure that people who seek an exception have the receipts essentially to justify it. And then the last thing I think you asked was comparing rent control to rent stabilization, which I apologize, I sometimes use the terms interchangeably. In I think there's in New York and California specifically, there are a few differences. So based on my work in California, I have learned that people like to call their local rent control policies rent control, but they are very similar to the policy that you're proposing. Um, in California, rent control also very commonly is passed in partnership with just cause, so that tenants are protected kind of full circle from various types of evictions and displacement. Now, in New York, as you had kind of mentioned, there is kind of old school first generation rent control, which is very strong. There are very few units left in New York City that are rent controlled. And then there's rent stabilization, where many more tenants benefit from. I want to say it's, well, I actually don't have the number, so I don't want to say the wrong number, but magnitudes more people in New York City benefit from rent stabilization than rent freeze, or sorry, than rent control. And rent stabilization, in that sense, is a more relaxed, moderate policy, often seen as second generation rent control, and is more synonymous to the policy that's proposed in Providence. So, generally, when I say rent control, I kind of mean rent stabilization. The terms are used interchangeably in some places. The places where it's not are New York, where they have a very clear rent control regime and a rent stabilization policy that are separate, and in California, where they just generally refer to rent regulation as rent control. And please
Thank you.
feel free to ask follow-ups if I did not
No,
get
that's
everything.
fine. Thank you. I have one more. The other one is in reference to the rate of return for landlords. What is seem fair in your research, and also with the assertion of or people indicating that investments will, or investors and developers will stop investing in cities when they have rent stabilization. Is there any evidence, or can you speak to that? What has been the impact, downward or upward, or stagnation in a way? Can you just expand on that?
Sure. Yes, so the Minneapolis research that is on slide 11 of what I shared with you all, that is that uses kind of a common market marker of return, which is internal rate of return. Um, and in that, based on the real estate pro formas that were used to do that projection, some common internal rates of return were like 16% for like an average or median building, and then on the high end, internal rate of return was 22%. I don't think any single person, or like I don't think my opinion of what a fair rate of return is should be used in policymaking, but I do know that a very common formula that is used across California and also in Montgomery County is the it's called the MNOI formula, which is, so basically they base their calculation of what a fair return is on maintenance net operating income. And I can follow up with more information on that because it gets a little bit wonky. But that is kind of seen as the gold standard in determining fair return in rent stabilization and rent control policies across the country.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the colleagues that are present? Councilwoman Althea Graves, we're going to get a microphone to you. And for our committee, again, I remind you that Council Policy is here. Aaron and Miguel, ready on standby. Thank you.
I think mine is more of a comment. And it's about Massachusetts and how they got rid of the rent stabilization because the rents had went down so low. And they said, oh, if we get rid of this, we'll be able to, there'll be a boom in new construction. and they found out that it wasn't a boom in new construction. I think that's one of the things that they're saying now. Oh, we shouldn't do this, because if we do this, everybody's going to up and leave and go back to Massachusetts so that they can build everything there, or whatever. I remember when people started coming down here, started buying up the things. We all said Boston, but it was people coming in from Mass. That started in the 90s, buying the properties up. And it probably was because of this rent stabilization going on up there. They started buying up the properties down here. Now you're using the same policies of this fear. Oh, if you do this and try to stop the rent, with this rent stabilization, all these horrible things are going to happen. They won't happen. And we need to stop doing this fear tactic stuff. I'm not saying don't buy properties down here. I'm just saying don't buy all the properties down here. I'm not saying don't buy the properties down here. I'm just saying don't raise the prices so high that we can't afford to live in them. I'm saying that we need to work together and allow everybody that's living here now the right to stay here. And not try to run everybody out. So that's my comment. I think if you look at this, you can see that what you were saying wasn't true then, and I don't think it will be true now. That's just my comment.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Councilwoman Harris.
Thank you so much. Tram, I want to thank you for this presentation tonight. Actually, I came in with quite a bit of questions that you were able to point out. I have a lot of respect for Policy Link. Policy Link been around a long time. For folks that don't know, when I worked at DARE, I got a quote in Policy Link, so that's why I'm giving the props, just for you, Tram. But my question is, I hear a lot of people say this, people that have a voice, say that rent stabilization, and I don't know whether you have any data behind it or whatever, or whether you've heard these certain things, rent stabilization does not serve the people who need it, which are people who are not receiving the income that they should receive, but definitely need housing and need to be placed and stay in their homes. They say that a lot of times the rent stabilization serves people like governors and students and folks with a lot of money. Have you heard that in your field of study? And have you heard people say stuff like that as you're moving around the continent and trying to understand some of the backlash of this? Because I think when you hear this, it definitely a lot of fear that sets in. It's like people have more money already getting these units, so now we're hearing that these places that we should be stabilized in could easily be replaced for people who have money. Does that make sense what I just said, or could I clear it up a little more?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. Thank you for the Policy Link shout out as well. Yes, this is something that I hear. Some of it is rooted in one very specific statistic, which I don't have the exact number, but I can kind of explain the premise and why a lot of myths kind of come from that. So there was one study that showed that higher income renters save more money from rent stabilization than lower income renters. And if you think about it, that is technically true, because if I am a renter who can afford $5,000 a month in rent, then the amount of money that I save from rent stabilization is dollar by dollar greater than the amount of money than someone whose rent is $1,000 will be saving. And so that statistic has actually been misconstrued in many ways by saying, by claims that say, wealthier people disproportionately benefit from rent stabilization policies. And it's because they pay more for rent, and so therefore, because rent is capped by a percent, the dollar amount that they save technically is greater than the dollar amount that a lower income renter pays. However, the dollar amount that the lower income renter saves is a much larger proportion of their income because of how cost burdened lower income renters are. And so, I think I'd like to debunk that myth officially, by stating that in the literature, it is clear that rent stabilization disproportionately benefits people of color and lower income renters because they are, due to the many racist practices in the housing industry in our country, people of color are more likely to be renters, more likely to be lower income, therefore more likely to benefit from rent stabilization. I think we also have to think about the power of rent stabilization. I said that it's unrivaled in speed and scale and cost efficiency. That is partially due to the fact that it applies to everyone. You don't have to means test for rent stabilization like we do for many other housing programs that, we don't have enough funding to reach all the people who need it. I think about public libraries or our public education system as another example of where, we don't say kids in rich families shouldn't get access to the library, right? So I think about rent stabilization the same. Whether you rent or own your home, you need housing stability and some kind of predictability in your housing costs. And the fixed interest rate mortgage that was created by the federal government gives that to homeowners like myself. And rent stabilization is our way of offering that similar type of protection to renters. And I think that its universality and the fact that it benefits everyone is actually what makes it strong. But it does disproportionately benefit lower income renters and people of color.
Thank you very much. Seeing no further question, any further questions? Councilman Royce?
Thank you.
And then after this, we're going to take a recess for a minute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Trump, I just had a, I guess, in the weeds, wonkier question about the frequency rate and approval rate when it comes to landlords coming before rent boards in cities that have passed rent stabilization. And so I'm wondering if you've looked at data or have access to data to show that how many units of a housing market have actually gone before a rent board to petition to exceed past the 4% cap. And so so one question is about the frequency rate of that. And then I'm interested in learning more about when a landlord comes before the board about the approval rate. Is it, have cities collected data on, have they approved a landlord's petition partially, like not reimbursed, but have allowed them to get reimbursement on certain things as a partial reimbursement or a full, a full approval on, let's say in Providence, like we were allowed to allow landlords to go to 10%. So, because I know our rent board, as it's written, would have some discretion in that. So, but I wonder if you could speak to that. And just before I give you the floor, I've looked at San Francisco, and which has their rent stabilization program has been pretty long-standing, as you know. And the research I could find is that they studied, I don't want to give the years, but it's pretty recent, and they found that about 93% of the housing market did not actually go before the board to petition for an increase past 4%. And I think there's many conclusions you could come away with. And one that I arrived to is that that's telling me that for many landlords, the cap is sufficient for landlords to make a reasonable profit and to maintain their properties. And so I know I have a tendency to give you a lot, but I'm wondering if you could speak to those points.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is kind of a tough one to speak to universally because every one of these jurisdictions has a different policy, and while many have rent boards or rent regulating bodies, they all have different procedures and rules. So, for example, in St. Paul, there was a self-certification process that I actually found to be quite weak because it's self-certifying. It means landlords would just submit a form, who knows where the form would go, and then they would just automatically get the rent increase that they asked for. So that's a pretty weak rulemaking, weak set of rules for implementation. And then there are places that have a much more clearly outlined procedure. So Montgomery County is the report that I have pulled up right now, and I think they have a very clear set of rules and procedures for landlords who seek to, who need a greater rent increase, or they have a fair return application process. They also have a petition process for capital improvements and substantial renovations. And I think it's, very similar to what you said. The volume of applications that they've received for rent increases above the cap is quite low, and I can share those numbers. And that tells me, like you have kind of guessed, that when there are not as many applications, that means that the policy is working well for people. If we saw a flood of petitions, then I think we'd want to look at what is the shared factor across all of these applications. So, for example, in Montgomery County, the amount of units that are covered by rent stabilization is, I want to say, 65,000 units. I will confirm that. Sorry, I want to get this one right. I think it's 63,000 units. And in the first year of implementation, received 3 applications from landlords for fair return rent increases above the cap. Those were received and approved. They received 3 capital improvement petitions. So those are, improvements that are much larger scale than maintenance, for example. So maybe it's a new water heater, a new roof, things like that. 3 of those were received and approved. And they also received 1 application for a substantial renovation exception, and that one was pending during the date of the report being published. So, I can't speak to every city's process because every rent board is different. Not all of them even published annual reports. The ones that do, they can often be hard to find. I've been trying to hunt all of them down. But I think in general, right, there's sometimes a fear that when you create a procedure, applications will flood in. And I think what I've seen in the cities that I've looked at through their rent board reports, their annual reports, that fear of the flood of applications that will take up staff capacity also does not come to fruition. If you have a clear process that's outlined and landlords know what is needed and the type of evidence they need and what counts and the full transparency of how the decision-making body is approving or denying appeals, then what we find is that landlords who were trying to find a loophole, they look at that list that requires all the receipts and they say, oh, I actually don't have the evidence to justify this. And so what you do get is a small number of applications where there is justification, which is why they are generally approved. So again, I can't speak to the procedures as a whole because they're all different, but I will say the level of detail that's in the proposed policy is strong. And I encourage you all to be very attentive to the rulemaking process. If there's another kind of chapter of that to outline in more detail the appeals process.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Tram Hong from the Senior Housing Associate at PolicyLink.org. Your presentation was very thorough, informative, and very insightful. We really appreciate it. We've answered many questions from the testimony that we have received thus far through this long process that we've had here in the city of Providence. So we thank you very much for your time and your presentation. At this time,
Thank you so much.
absolutely, and many blessings to you. Thank you. At this time, we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and we'll come back to take the next step. Thank you very much. Welcome back. Thank you very much. Again, great presentation from Tram Hong, and great questions from the committee members and also counselors that are present with us. Any further questions or any other comments before I make also some comments and then also open it up to our colleagues? What we're going to do is that just wanted to first thank everyone for their hard work from the policy, Aaron, Miguel, June, and all of our staff are really doing a tremendous work in putting all these hearings together and also the bill. To the sponsor, Council President Miller, and many of you. I wanted to make sure that as chair of this committee, that we took our time and that we provided enough time to hear from our constituents. And we had several hearings in our districts and even here. That we've got to the point that we have the best that we can to provide a rent stabilization ordinance that addresses the concerns that we all had on behalf of our constituents. I've always said that even our mayor knows and had concluded that we were in a crisis and the state is in a crisis. For me personally, I've seen this many times since being in public office from the Senate and chairing the Housing and Municipal Government in the Senate and talking about 20 years in the making, and our families and our neighborhoods are being challenged every day due to the economic pressures that we have. Rent stabilization in this bill is not perfect, and we said it from the beginning. Everyone had the opportunity to speak to us individually. We had the opportunity to engage one another as colleagues, engage constituents at every level, homeowners, landlords, tenants, having meetings in our communities through our ward community meetings. And I commend all of you for taking the time on behalf of our constituents. And I also wanted to highlight a couple of things, and that is also the leadership of our chairwoman, Mary Kay Harris, and the Housing Task Force. And I want to highlight that is because for many years, as when she was an activist and I was in the Senate, we fought against predatory lending, along also with Council President Miller. But I also recognize the fact that everything has been outlined here. In 2023, this task force was formed. And one of the recommendations was, how do we stabilize our families? How do we stabilize our neighborhoods? And we just heard from Tram that it's not a perfect bill that has been already precedent in 200 cities, whether that is rent stabilization and rent control. But the important thing is that it sort of also slows down gentrification to a certain extent. And the greater benefit, and the people that are going to benefit from this, and I hope that we all see the light in our city, whether it's from the mayor or even from the state, that we need to continue to pour in as much as possible to the housing crisis that we have and the economic crisis that we have, and that is going to continue. But also to not only Councilwoman Harris for chairing the task force, but to say that even almost the entire task force that was put together is in support of rent stabilization. And I think that that's notable. And if you haven't had the opportunity to, as people are hearing us, haven't had the opportunity to read this report, I recommend that you continue to read it. This ordinance is a result of a deliberate and sustained public engagement. Since introduction on January 22nd, there has been an extensive outreach both in formal council settings and directly in our neighborhoods, ensuring that we receive feedback from residents, advocates, stakeholders from across the city. There is a broad consensus on the core issues, regardless of perspective. There's agreement that Providence is in a housing crisis, and inaction is not an option. We have gotten to this place. The council has already taken multiple steps to address the housing challenges. This ordinance builds on a broader legislative strategy, which includes strengthening the Housing Trust Fund to ensure that funds are directed towards affordable projects within the city. Allowing accessory dwelling units by right to increase our housing supply. Advancing zoning reforms to support the increased density consistent with the comprehensive plan. Because the projection is that Providence and the state of Rhode Island is a hot place. People want to be here. People have said it, they want to see the population increase. But we know that also we need more housing, and at the end of the day, when I look at our city council and our city is made up of neighborhoods. And the average income in my neighborhood is less than $30,000. And so I ask all of you, my colleagues, as you're thinking about when you're voting, is to think about also, and I know that through your heart in the conversation, you think about your constituents. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that people have a roof over their head. And so I conclude to say to all of you is that this ordinance is part of a coordinated policy work, not a standalone action. I hope and continue to say that even the mayor, even all of us in our city council, whether we disagree on policies, the time has come that we pass rent stabilization today, that we pass rent stabilization for the neighborhoods, for the people, and I urge my colleagues to support it and tonight and move it onto the floor. Thank you very much. Let's protect our residents. Councilman Sanchez.
Thank you, Chairman Pichardo. First and foremost, I just want to thank you, the clerks, our policy team, for this robust process. This has been the most vetted piece of legislation that has ever come out of these chambers. There has not been a piece of legislation that has had multiple public hearings in this chamber and multiple sessions of public engagement out in the community, and that in itself is something that we need to be very grateful for and highlight. And want to thank all of our staff, not just our policy team. I know constituent services helped. Our comms team has done a tremendous amount of work to engage our neighbors, and that's why we're here in these positions. We're here to represent our neighbors, and every neighbor, not just folks in our specific wards, but every neighbor across the city. That includes renters, that includes landlords, that includes folks that don't have any housing. And with that last group of population, that's where I really, that's where a lot of my motivation comes from. As folks are aware, I've worked with our unhoused population in the past couple years, and you see the reality, the consequences of inaction, of legislation not helping our most needed folks. And if we're not helping the people that need our help the most, then what are we doing here as elected officials? So that's always been my guiding principle, is to give people that need help the most as much as possible, because if we help people that truly need help the most, and folks have a roof over their head, something that we should all have in this society, if we're not doing that as a bare minimum, then what are we doing? And, folks have shared that we've been very honest and upfront since the beginning of this process. This isn't going to solve our housing crisis. All of us have said that from the beginning. We have pointed to the work that we've done the past couple years when it comes to zoning, when it comes to housing trust bonds. And I've been at the front row. All of us have, but I'll speak specifically from my experience. I've been a member of the Providence Redevelopment Agency where we've seen a lot of this work happen in terms of millions of dollars going to affordable housing, which is great. In the comprehensive plan, I pushed to remove the exclusive single-family zone in my ward, and obviously some neighbors weren't too happy about that. But at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do to encourage development. We've done other practices as well. We've supported a lot of work at the State House. Give folks in the General Assembly a lot of credit. The past couple of years, they've been doing a lot, and we've been very supportive of that work. But even all that work that's being done is still not enough. People that have called Providence home for decades are being displaced at a rate that is destroying the fabric of the city, our neighborhoods, our communities that have called Providence a home for decades. My family came here to Providence in the late 80s, had that quote-unquote American dream to start a small business, to buy property. I've had family members, own triple-deckers, and the fact that folks right now don't have that opportunity, it's a disgrace, honestly. It's leading, it's pointing in a way that folks that want to call Providence home just aren't able to. And that's really unfortunate. When we have the tools available to us, I've been as open as possible in terms of listening to feedback and getting people's input. But a lot of the input that's being shared with us is people that are directly profiting unlimited amounts of money in this business model that they've carried for decades. And coming from a family of small business entrepreneurs, I give people a lot of grace, and I give people a lot of benefit of doubt when it comes to their business models. But the reality is that we have constructed an ordinance that still allows people to raise rents. What we're doing is limiting how much you can do that over a certain period of time. Someone that, has multiple properties and is able to still raise rent by a 4% annual basis is still making money. And the fact that we have a mechanism in place in this ordinance that if there's unexpected expenses, if there's unexpected costs, they still have the mechanism to petition a board of appointed civic leaders to make their case on why maybe they need to raise the rent more. So all that to say is that we have an opportunity here as a legislative body to really, stand up and truly represent the people of Providence. I think a lot of people in this chamber, of my colleagues at least, are either supportive or very open to at least engaging in it. What's been really disappointing is folks that, have shared concerns or have said things, that might assume that, they had concerns. Haven't really brought amendments to this ordinance. Because at the end of the day, I want to listen to everyone's ideas as long as it moves us in the right direction. So obviously there's a lot of forces out there that don't want to see this happen because it impacts their unlimited ability to make as much money as possible. And I'm sorry, but what is happening right now is what we've seen this winter. People are literally freezing to death in our city. And you don't put a price on human life. And that's why I'm supporting this piece of rent stabilization, and I'm committed to every other proposal that moves us in a direction of having a more affordable city for all. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman Miguel Sanchez. Councilman Royes.
Thank you, Chair. I have so many thoughts circulating in my mind, and I share many of the same thoughts that my colleague has just shared. I guess I want to just kind of, as we're about to take a vote, a neighbor in Ward 4 who I met several months ago at Dunkin' Donuts, as much of that sounds like a Rhode Island story, I was meeting with another constituent at that time, and this neighbor approached me, recognized me as the counselor, and had actually interrupted my conversation, which I didn't mind, but I could tell she was in she was living through a moment of desperation, and I learned a lot about her, and obviously I won't. She will remain nameless here, but she had explained to me that her only source of income was living on SSI, and currently she was living in her GMC truck for about, at that time, 8 months, and this is through the middle of the winter. And she was living in her truck with her daughter. And this neighbor was experiencing, she had cancer, and so she had a very difficult quality of life. And she had explained to me when I asked her, what explained her circumstance, and she had said that her fixed income could not absorb the sudden rent increase that she had experienced by her landlord. And it got me thinking about a lot of things, including that unfortunately this city did not pass rent stabilization 10 years ago. And she's still living in her car, and she purchases gasoline, runs her truck at night, and to stay warm. And the most I could have done for her in that moment is help her create a GoFundMe. I helped her apply for public housing, which she did, but she sits on a waiting list, thousands ahead of her. And so, I wonder, as we move in this process, and I've been very public about my stance, I hope this passes the full council, but I just wish we had acted sooner. So I want to share that, because as I'm hearing everyone's thoughts, and I'm thinking about that neighbor, and I want to thank the policy staff who worked so hard to craft this. I want to thank our council leadership. I want to thank the journalists who have covered this. I want to thank the neighbors who have listened thoughtfully and challenged me and pushed back, but who have, I think, respected, whether we agree or not, respected why I've arrived to this conclusion. I'm also thinking about this theme of making Providence. We often hear it a lot in sort of the political ecosystem, where politicals often, say we want Providence to turn into a world-class city. And I've probably said some similar thoughts about how I feel about that statement. And I often, when I hear that, I think of, public officials wanting Providence to be a city for outsiders. When I hear this feeling of wanting to turn this city into a world-class city. And I often find that when you speak to regular folks who have lived in the city for a long time, it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to access the amenities that maybe outsiders love about Providence. Maybe that's dining on Fed Hill. Maybe that's buying a ticket to watch a Providence college basketball game. As folks become more rent burdened, those amenities that outsiders enjoy in our own city become increasingly just simply a dream. And so I believe that rent stabilization will begin to honor, if we pass this, begin to honor the residents that have lived here for a long time, and it sends a strong message that we want you to remain in the city. We want your family to remain in our neighborhoods and to not be displaced, because we believe strongly that when neighbors are not displaced, that what we are protecting is the trust, the relationships we built, and that I think speaks to the fabric of our neighborhoods. And I just believe, yes, this is not going to solve the housing crisis, but it's gonna help protect the fabric of our neighborhoods. I shared this in a video today with the help of our comms, but I think it's worth mentioning, and I actually speaking to Councilor Pearson about this, but even our children who attend our Providence public schools, about 400 students currently in PPSD are experiencing homelessness. And, there's often sort of this landlord talking point that the reason why folks can't afford their rent is because they've mismanaged their money, as if buying one less coffee at Dunkin' Donuts is going to keep you housed. I would imagine that the majority of those 400 families who are experiencing homelessness in Providence have not mismanaged their money. I think about the children who are impacted by that, who are living in crowded living rooms, potentially shelters, potentially cars. I think about how difficult it is for them to receive their education, that anxiety, that depression, that trauma that they live through. It's difficult for them to feel safe, for them to regulate their emotions, for them to be fully immersed in their coursework. I've heard a lot by the real estate lobby that we should remove emotions from this. Well, if we put that to the side for a second, which I disagree with, but let's deal in the data. These are children. These are humans. When we talk about the impact of educational outcomes, when it comes to housing instability, those are real data points. And I think there's a social cost to housing instability. I think there's a social cost to displacement. And again, when I speak about landlords, I'm really talking about the corporate landlords. And I think they have for a long time privatized the gains and socialized the cost to our city. And unfortunately, there's not going to be one study to capture the social cost that our residents have experienced. And so I'll end my remarks by just again thanking this committee. I know the name is Hope, and I will just say it's hard to be hopeful with everything happening from the federal government and down. I think it's hard to be hopeful these days, but as cliche as this may sound, I am very hopeful in this moment. And I hope that for colleagues who are on the fence about rent stabilization, I really hope that you will come around and resist the stubborn forces, resist the campaign contributions, because what's at stake right now are those 400 families, those 400 children who need us right now. And so I'll leave it at that. But thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak.
Thank you very much, Councilman Arroyos. Councilwoman Shelley Peterson.
Thank you. It's a little difficult to follow up with that. Thank you, Councilman Reyes, for your words and the conversation previous as we were preparing to come into committee. As with everybody else, I want to make sure that I thank the policy team here. We ask a lot of our policy team on many different fronts, and every single one of us has specific concerns that we bring forward to you, and every single one of you has always been very diligent and willing to work with us. So thank you very much for all of that. It means a lot to me. I've spent a great deal of time listening to testimony on both sides of this ordinance, and I want to begin by acknowledging the work that has gone into it. I've spoken with dozens of renters, landlords, and colleagues, and I'm grateful to all of them for sharing their perspectives, and those perspectives, they all matter. The landlord who worked hard to purchase a few properties and build generational wealth for their family is just as important in this conversation as the renter who is struggling to save while barely making ends meet. This is a thoughtful proposal, and it's rooted in a very real concern about housing stability in our city. If there's one consistent takeaway from every conversation that I've had, is that people are genuinely worried about Providence and about their ability to move forward here. At the same time, much of what we've heard in both support and in opposition has been based on assumptions. We've heard predictions about what will happen to rents, development, landlords, and tenants. But predictions are not the same as evidence, especially when they're not grounded in Providence's specific reality. There are valid concerns about how rent control has played out in other cities, just as there are examples of stabilization policies working in places with similar size and demographics. The truth is that we can't really rely solely on the outcomes from elsewhere to guide decisions here at home. As someone who came into this undecided, I take that responsibility very seriously. My role is not to respond to pressure or rhetoric from either side, but to make the best decision I can based on what's actually happening here in our city and in my ward. And when I take a look at what's actually happening, this picture becomes pretty clear for me. This council has taken meaningful steps to increase housing production. We've expanded opportunities for development, approved projects intended to meet demand. Since January 2025, nearly 1,000 units are actively being built. But when we actually take a closer look, only a small fraction of those units are single-family homes or homes accommodating families. Much of the development that we're seeing is not geared towards long-term residents or families. The reality across our neighborhoods is not the same. In Elmhurst, the median household income is about $69,300 with a 37% renter occupancy. In Wanskuck, the median drops to roughly $39,400 with 66% of residents renting, and nearly half of the households, are cost burdened. Cost burdened meaning they have to expend or spend more than 30% of their monthly income just in rent, just to be able to put housing over their heads. These are not abstract numbers, they are city-reported data, and it reflects the very real challenges people are facing right now. The economic reality today is fundamentally different than it was 20 to 30 years ago. The idea that a household can rely on a single income, save, and eventually purchase a home is out of reach for many. A single minimum wage worker in this state who can afford the median rent. That is not sustainable. In Ward 14, we face an added challenge with the expansion of student housing. Increased enrollment continues to put pressure on surrounding neighborhoods, bringing quality of life concerns, traffic, and a strain on housing availability. Meanwhile, much of the development tied to this demand is not designed for families or long-term residents. It reinforces a cycle that places the burden on existing neighbors while doing little to stabilize the broader housing market. This is why I'm introducing 2 amendments to the ordinance tonight with support of the lead sponsors. The first says that new construction exemption will not apply to any units within a college student residential overlay district, a clear signal to student housing developers that they need to operate with the needs of the surrounding neighbors in mind. The second requires the city each year to request that our colleges and universities submit 5-year enrollment projections, which the administration will then compile and share with our council. This information can be used to inform housing policy, planning, and displacement mitigation efforts. Alleviating university-driven development pressures and garnering the data necessary to make informed decisions needs to be part of this continued work. I believe we need to sharpen this conversation and ground it in real local data. We need to fully understand our rent trends, our vacancy rates, our eviction patterns, and how supply is changing across our neighborhoods. If we're going to adopt a policy of this scale, it must be informed by the realities of Providence, not projections or comparisons. Moving this ordinance forward tonight is not the end point for me, it's a step. And as it moves forward, my continued support will depend on making sure this policy reflects the specific needs of our communities. That includes better data on student housing impacts and ensuring that corporate-driven development doesn't continue to shape the market in the way that pushes residents out. At the end of the day, this vote is about whether we are willing to act on the reality in front of us, not the assumptions around us, and take a measured step toward making Providence a city where people can afford to stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Shelley Peterson. Seeing no further comment, I will entertain a motion to approve. Yeah. I will entertain a motion to approve as amended.
As amended, so moved.
As amended, the Providence Rent Stabilization Act. The motion has been moved by Councilwoman Shelley Peterson, seconded by Councilman Miguel Luna, and
Hey, he's looking down.
seconded by Miguel Sanchez and Councilman Royes. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any abstention? The ayes have it. The Providence Rent Stabilization Act as amended passes. Thank you. We set out and we committed ourselves to an open, deliberate process, spending years listening to residents, engaging with stakeholders, and grounding our work in research. The result is balanced ordinance we are proud to recommend to the full council, one that brings stability to renters while ensuring property owners can continue to maintain and invest in their buildings. It responds with urgency that matches the scale of the housing crisis with the deep care for everyone affected, both renters and small local landlords. Rent stabilization interrupts that cycle of speculation and wealth expectation that allows predatory lenders and investors and actors not to buy our communities. I want to thank the entire City Council team once again for their hard work. I know we're going to take another opportunity to state our piece along with our colleagues that are present here. On April 2nd, next Thursday, this will move on to the full council and we will be voting on the Providence Rent Stabilization Act. Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn? The motion has been made, second. Any discussion? No discussion, and all those approve? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.